Before we get started, hit the comments and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Whether you're catching sunrise in Nairobi, burning midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to hear from you. Don't just watch silently, let me know where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The cabin of the C-130 thundered with the roar of engines, a metallic heartbeat shaking the floor under Lieutenant Elias Brandt's boots. He sat slouched against a hard plastic wall, a simple backpack clutched on his lap, trying to disappear into the chaos. Around him, soldiers double-checked straps, murmuring codes that sounded like a foreign language to him. Elias was just a passenger, or at least that's what everyone assumed. His face, calm and unremarkable under a baseball cap, gave nothing away. Until the moment the first F-16 streaked across the sky, a flash of silver and blue against the cloud line, the pilot's reactions changed everything. Inside the cockpit, the young pilot, Callan Royce, froze mid-gesture. His eyes widened, a choke of disbelief catching in his throat. He muttered the words nobody should ever speak aloud in a war zone. "It's him?" Sweat spattered his helmet visor as the other pilot, Jenna Kessler, turned sharply, following the line of sight. Her grip on the throttle tightened. The world seemed to tilt. Every second stretched like an eternity. The man on the cargo floor, the single dad no one knew was more than just a passenger, had a history they couldn't erase. He carried a past that made seasoned pilots shiver, and the sight of him turned a routine mission into a nightmare. Elias' gaze stayed fixed on the floor, but his mind ran at a different pace. He had rehearsed this moment for months, never expecting it would come like this. Sudden, violent, uninvited. The hum of the engines vibrated in his chest, matching the rapid pulse that threatened to betray his calm exterior. Memories of a long-ago battlefield in the Middle East flickered behind his eyes. The smell of gunpowder, the scent of scorched sand, the sting of loss so deep it became a scar on the soul. And now, here he was, thousands of feet above the Pacific, surrounded by soldiers who didn't know he could hold their world in his hands with nothing but instinct, grit, and history. The aircraft jolted, a sharp lurch that made everyone gasp. Outside, tracer fire arced like deadly ribbons against the setting sun, barely visible through the reinforced windows. Elias tightened his jaw. One hand brushed the strap of his backpack. There was nothing inside but a few personal items. A photo of his 10-year-old daughter, a worn notebook, a pen. And yet, in the minds of the pilots racing through the skies above, this seemingly ordinary man was anything but ordinary. Callan Royce's voice broke over the radio, shaking. "Command, we have a complication. Repeat, we need clearance now." His hands trembled, betraying fear he had never felt in years of flying supersonic jets. Jenna's glare snapped him back. "Focus, Callan. Eyes on the target." But even she couldn't shake it. The recognition was visceral. Elias Brandt, the man nobody questioned, had become a legend whispered in military circles. A ghost from the battlefield, a lone figure whose name could turn steel nerves to jelly. And now, in the middle of this ordinary cargo flight, he sat quietly, blending in. Waiting. Elias' eyes flicked up once, just a fraction, scanning the compartment. Soldiers moved around him, unaware. He smiled faintly, almost apologetically, and returned to his quiet observance. No one could guess what he carried in his past, and no one could imagine the storm he was about to unleash. Outside, the F-16s banked, engines screaming. Inside, the tension coiled like a spring, waiting for release. And somewhere deep down, Elias knew that in less than 5 minutes, nothing would ever be ordinary again. The radio crackled, a staccato warning that cut through the drone of engines. Hostiles spotted. Coordinates, the line went dead. Silence. Then a single phrase from Royce, trembling, echoing through the cockpit like a gunshot. "It's him?" Elias' hand brushed his backpack again, resting on the photo of his daughter. He drew a slow breath. Time had stopped. Or maybe it was only beginning. The apartment in Tacoma smelled faintly of cinnamon and worn carpet. Sunlight slanted through dusty blinds, landing on a small wooden table cluttered with crayons, half-finished homework, and a steaming mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Elias Brandt knelt beside the chair where his daughter, Amira, scribbled fiercely in a notebook, her small tongue peeking out in concentration. The world outside could burn, the battles could rage, but here, in this cramped apartment, Elias had one mission: make sure Amira felt safe. That he ran a calloused hand through his hair, feeling the tension of years spent keeping secrets, fighting wars nobody knew about. The medals he once earned hung in a drawer, hidden from prying eyes. His neighbors saw a quiet man, a single dad struggling with 2 jobs, never missing soccer practice, never skipping a bedtime story. But beneath the calm exterior was a lifetime of combat, of ghosts that never rested. Elias had learned the hard way that to protect your child, sometimes you had to bury your own past. Amira looked up, eyes wide, and asked the question he always dreaded, "Dad, why don't we ever visit Uncle Marcus?" Elias' chest tightened. Uncle Marcus had been his mentor, the one who had taught him everything in Afghanistan, who had saved his life more times than he could count. But Uncle Marcus had fallen, leaving a wound that had never healed. "Someday, baby," Elias said softly, forcing a smile. "Someday you'll meet him. You'll understand." He tried to hide the tremor in his voice, but Amira, perceptive as ever, tilted her head and frowned. The sound of the front door closing made him glance up. His neighbor Mrs. Havens waved from the corridor, oblivious to the storm swirling beneath Elias' calm. Life demanded normalcy, school projects, grocery runs, bedtime stories. Yet, every quiet evening was underscored by the constant hum of vigilance. He knew the world could change in a heartbeat and that one day he might have to leave Amira behind to protect her. That day was not today. But he felt it approaching like the edge of a knife brushing against skin. Elias' phone vibrated, jolting him out of thought. A coded message, short and cold. Asterisk, flight details confirmed. Be ready. Asterisk, he swallowed hard, heart clenching. Amira noticed the shadow cross his face. "Is it work, Dad?" she asked. "Yes, baby." "Just work," he replied, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He wanted to explain, to tell her everything, but some truths are too heavy for small hands. The secret he carried wasn't just a burden. It was a weapon, invisible but lethal. As he packed his bag that evening, slipping in nothing but essentials, the memories came flooding. The firefights in deserts, the narrow escapes, the men he couldn't save. Every loss etched into his soul, every victory a silent burden. And now, a quiet, ordinary flight awaited him, yet he sensed it would erupt into chaos. He couldn't shake the feeling that the past had a way of catching up, that history had a long memory. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. Protect his daughter, complete the mission, survive. Not necessarily in that order. By midnight, Amira was asleep, her small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of innocence. Elias stood by the window, staring at the city lights, thinking about the life he had tried to build. A life of normalcy, laughter, bedtime stories. But the truth was inescapable. War had followed him home, and now it was chasing him across the sky. He closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and whispered a silent vow. Asterisk, no matter what, I will come back. I must. Asterisk. Outside, the world seemed still, but Elias knew it was an illusion. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every moment of calm was temporary. The same instinct that had saved his life countless times now warned him. The flight ahead would test him in ways nothing else ever had. And deep down, he knew that the pilots who would soon see his face in the sky had no idea who they were dealing with. The tarmac of Naval Air Station Whidbey Island was slick with early morning dew, reflecting the pale orange glow of dawn. Soldiers moved in disciplined patterns, boots clacking against concrete, voices clipped and professional. Elias Brandt stepped onto the runway with a plain duffel bag slung over his shoulder, keeping his gaze low. To anyone watching, he was just another civilian passenger, a quiet man blending into a sea of uniforms. But every step carried the weight of 1,000 battles, muscles coiled, senses alert to the slightest shift in the air. As the C-130 loomed ahead, its engines already vibrating with power, Elias felt the familiar rush of anticipation that had accompanied him through countless missions. He boarded last, letting the soldiers pass ahead, slipping into an empty corner near the rear ramp. The interior smelled of fuel and metal, and the drone of engines hummed in his ears like a warning. Soldiers' chatter filled the cabin, a rhythm of names, jokes, and checklists, oblivious to the storm silently waiting among them. Elias' eyes scanned every detail: straps, compartments, hatches, the faint reflection of his own face in the aluminum wall. The flight crew, young and eager, moved with precise efficiency. Callan Royce and Jenna Kessler, the two F-16 pilots who would soon panic at the sight of him, were in communication with ground command. Their voices carried over radios, clipped, formal, unaware of the man in the cargo hold who had already seen more chaos than they could imagine. Elias' presence was an anomaly. He didn't belong here, or rather no one thought he did. But history has a way of catching up, and in a few minutes it would. Time slowed as the cargo ramp sealed and the C-130 began its taxi. Elias adjusted his position, making himself small, quiet, invisible. Yet beneath the stillness, his body thrummed with tension, reflexes ready, mind calculating. Memories of ambushes, firefights, and impossible escapes played like silent film reels behind his eyes. Each one sharpened him, reminded him of the man he had been and the father he had to remain. Amira's face flashed in his mind, her small hands gripping his fingers, trusting him to keep her safe. That trust was a weapon stronger than any rifle, any ordnance, any strategy. The soldiers around him continued their routines, unaware of the undercurrent of tension building in the cabin. One of them, Private Ruiz, nudged a comrade, whispering about how quiet the civilian passenger was. Elias only smiled faintly, the gesture unreadable. To the world he was invisible. But in the sky, at altitude, facing enemy threats and the F-16s above, invisibility was a fragile luxury. He checked the straps of his backpack once more, empty except for a few personal items, yet heavy with symbolic weight. Then the radio crackled. Callan's voice, urgent, broke the monotony. All units, maintain formation. Eyes open. Something's off. Elias felt the cabin tilt slightly as the C-130 accelerated down the runway. Engines roared, wind howled over the fuselage, and the aircraft lifted, dragging him into the sky. The soldiers braced, straps creaking under tension. Elias held himself steady, heart pounding, eyes flicking between windows and cargo compartments, calculating. The invisible war had begun. High above the Pacific, the first glimmers of metal streaked against clouds. The F-16s moved with precision, slicing the sky, their pilots scanning for anomalies. That's when Callan's eyes widened, recognition snapping through him like lightning. "It's him," he whispered, voice trembling. Jenna's head snapped toward him, the realization spreading instantly. Elias Brandt, the quiet man who had been nothing but a passenger moments ago, now carried the weight of legends. In their minds, history collided with the present, and the cabin's silence became a charged wire ready to snap. Elias adjusted his position, fingers brushing the backpack one last time. Every muscle coiled, every nerve sharpened. He wasn't just a father or a passenger. He was a storm waiting to break, a force the pilots couldn't anticipate. Outside, the sky burned with morning light. Inside, tension thickened like smoke and the world seemed to hold its breath. In minutes, everything would change. The sun had climbed higher over the Pacific, casting a silver gleam on the waves below. The C-130 hummed through the thin morning air, steady, relentless. Elias Brandt sat near the rear, his back against the cold metal wall, eyes scanning the horizon through tiny portholes. He kept his posture calm, almost casual, but inside, his mind raced. Every instinct sharpened. Every sound, every shadow of movement outside, was a potential threat. Yet the real storm wasn't below, it was above. Inside the cockpit of the lead F-16, Callan Royce's knuckles whitened around the controls. His eyes darted between instruments and the cargo plane below. I see him," his voice cracked, low, trembling. Jenna Kessler leaned forward, following his line of sight. And then she saw it, the calm, composed face of a man they both recognized from classified briefings and whispered stories. Elias Brandt. A ghost from missions they were told never to discuss. A man whose reputation alone could shatter morale. Panic surged, quick and hot, as their minds struggled to reconcile a civilian passenger with a living legend. Back in the cargo hold, Elias remained still, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the tension radiating from the cockpit. He had learned long ago that recognition was dangerous. A single glance could trigger a chain reaction, and the pilots were already reacting before he had moved. Years of battle had taught him patience, timing, precision. Now the F-16s above were unknowingly baited, their fear visible even through the reinforced cockpit glass. Callan's radio squawked in a frenzy. "Command. Repeat. The passenger, he's not just a passenger. Confirm identity. What the hell is he doing here?" Jenna's sharp voice cut in, trying to regain control. "Eyes on him, Callan. Focus." He could, but she trailed off, frozen by disbelief. Recognition in their world meant danger. Elias Brandt wasn't a name spoken lightly. He had survived ambushes that would have killed entire squads. He had disappeared into hostile territory with nothing but instincts and sheer will. And now here he was, sitting silently, waiting. Inside the cargo hold, Elias shifted subtly, just enough to adjust his backpack. His fingers brushed over the photo of his daughter tucked inside, a reminder of why he had to survive. Every instinct screamed at him to stay calm, to control the narrative. In the skies above, the F-16 pilots flinched, making minor course adjustments, unaware that every move they made was now being anticipated. Elias had been in this position before, Outnumbered, underestimated by the enemy. But he had always prevailed. Suddenly, a distant blip on the radar indicated another aircraft closing fast. Callan muttered under his breath, "If he moves?" The words hung unfinished because in that split second, both pilots realized that Elias' reputation wasn't a rumor. He had done what others could only dream of, and the realization that he was in their mission area, unaccounted for, was enough to make their stomachs turn. Every protocol they had followed seemed trivial now, meaningless against a man who had become a force of nature in military circles. Elias' eyes narrowed as he caught the glint of sunlight reflecting off the F-16's canopy. Timing was everything. He didn't need weapons or reinforcements. All he needed was the advantage of surprise and the fact that no one suspected him. Fear, he knew, was a weapon just as lethal as a rifle. The pilots above were trembling, invisible threads of anxiety tethering them to the realization that he could control the next moments entirely. In that instant, the cabin of the C-130 felt smaller, the hum of engines louder, and the world tilted on its axis. Elias leaned slightly forward, a subtle but deliberate movement, and the F-16s reacted instantly, jerking in tandem. Recognition had sparked panic. And in the sky above, the difference between life and death had narrowed to a single man's gaze. Time seemed to stretch. Elias Brandt wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the storm, and everyone else was about to feel the first gust. The sky above the Pacific shimmered with heat and light as the C-130 cruised steadily, but the calm was deceptive. Elias Brandt's eyes scanned the horizon, calculating angles, distances, and timing. He wasn't armed, at least not in any visible way, but that didn't matter. In the world he had mastered, the mind was the deadliest weapon. The F-16 pilots, Callan Royce and Jenna Kessler, still reeling from recognition, were off balance, making micro-errors that could cost them everything. Elias could feel it. From the cockpit, Callan's voice wavered. "She's moving, what is he doing?" The F-16's trajectory shifted slightly, almost imperceptible but enough for Elias to note. The pilot's reactions, frantic and uncoordinated, were exactly what he needed. He adjusted his own posture, leaning subtly against the fuselage, breathing slow, measured, each motion a silent command. Panic spread like wildfire through the cockpit, their fear feeding him a power they could not imagine. Below, the waves glimmered, catching the morning sun. It was a serene sight, and yet the threat looming above turned beauty into tension. Elias' mind flashed back to a night in Kandahar, lying in the sand under a crescent moon, listening to enemy patrols pass by, hearts pounding in unison with his own. The instinctive patience, the ability to wait, to strike at the exact right moment, had saved him countless times. Now, in the sky above the Pacific, that skill was his greatest weapon. Callan tried to radio command again, but his words faltered. We can't, he's, Jenna cut in sharply, her voice taut with disbelief and frustration. Recognition had escalated to paralysis. Elias knew that in this split second, their training collided with fear, and fear always won first. He shifted his gaze toward the small panel of digital instruments lining the fuselage, seeing the exact timing of the approaching threat, the F-16's positions relative to his own. The opportunity was clear. A sudden maneuver from the lead F-16 sent the aircraft banking sharply, the sun reflecting off the canopy blindingly. Elias anticipated it, a ghost from battles past guiding his instincts. With the precision of someone who had survived dozens of firefights, he moved, small, deliberate motions, no more than a shift in his position. But in the minds of the pilots above, it was cataclysmic. Their coordination faltered, the formation wobbling as they tried to regain composure. For a moment, the air itself seemed to resist them. Below the fuselage, the Pacific stretched endlessly, indifferent to the tension above. But for those in the air, the consequences were immediate. Callan's voice broke over the radio. He's controlling the impossible. Jenna's hands shook on the throttle, her eyes darting between instruments and the C-130. Elias Brandt wasn't firing missiles or dropping bombs. He was manipulating them, reading their reactions, predicting their mistakes with uncanny accuracy. The psychological strike had begun, invisible yet devastating. Every movement, every breath, every subtle shift from Elias tightened the tension. The F-16s corrected too late, nearly colliding in their panic. Callan cursed under his breath, realizing their training, their protocols, meant nothing against the calm, deliberate threat in the cargo hold. Elias' reputation, his presence, was a weapon in itself. And the pilots now knew with cold clarity that they had underestimated him. As the minutes stretched, Elias allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. He hadn't struck physically, yet, but the first strike, the mental dominance, had already been delivered. The F-16 pilots were scrambling, shaken, unsure how to proceed. And Elias, quiet, composed, a single father in appearance only, prepared for the next phase. The storm had begun. And the sky itself seemed to tremble under the weight of what was coming. The C-130 rattled violently as turbulence tore through the clouds, tossing soldiers against harnesses. Elias Brandt remained unmoved, his calm a stark contrast to the chaos around him. The F-16s above circled like predators, engines screaming, their pilots' panic still raw. Callan Royce gritted his teeth, voice cracking over the radio. "We can't. I've never seen anything like this." Jenna Kessler tightened her grip on the throttle, eyes locked on the cargo plane. The realization sank in, they were no longer dealing with a civilian. Elias Brandt was a force that defied logic, a shadow from the past that had manifested in the present. Elias rose slowly from his corner, letting the momentum of the plane sway his movements. Each step was deliberate, silent, almost choreographed. His eyes scanned the cabin, taking in the soldiers, the crates, the humming engines, and then back to the small window revealing the frantic F-16s. He knew he had minutes, maybe seconds, to assert control before the chaos escalated beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The weight of his backpack pressed against him, but inside it was nothing but personal items. A photo of his daughter, a pen, a notebook. The real weapon was his mind and the mastery it carried. Callan Royce's voice cut through the radio again, frantic. "Command, there's no protocol for this. He's controlling the situation from inside." Jenna shook her head, disbelief etched into every line of her face. Both of them had trained for every conceivable aerial threat, but nothing could have prepared them for a single father whose mere presence altered everything. Elias could almost hear their thoughts, predict their movements, read the panic cascading like dominoes through their minds. He moved closer to the ramp, careful, precise, every motion deliberate. Soldiers glanced at him, curiosity and unease flickering in their eyes. Elias caught their gazes, held them, and then looked away, returning to his calm posture. The message was simple. Nothing to see, yet everything to fear. Outside, the F-16s began to tighten their formation, trying to regain control, but every maneuver was anticipated. The pilots were running blind, the psychological advantage entirely his. A sudden alarm blared in the cockpit, triggered by minor turbulence combined with panic-driven miscalculations. Callan cursed, jerking the controls, narrowly avoiding a collision with his wingman. Jenna's eyes widened, hands trembling. Elias observed quietly, noting every reaction, every flaw exposed by fear. His past had trained him for this. Ambushes, impossible odds, moments when a single decision determined life or death. Now the stakes were personal as well. Then it happened, a sudden dive from one of the F-16s intended to intimidate, to test his response. Elias shifted, small, almost imperceptible, yet the pilots interpreted it as movement signaling aggression. Their maneuvers became reckless, uncoordinated. Panic had fully set in. Elias' calm presence, the weight of history behind his eyes, had become a weapon more lethal than any missile. Inside the cabin, a soldier whispered, noticing the strange tension. "Sir, he's just sitting there." "How?" Elias allowed a small smile, almost imperceptible. He didn't need to explain. They couldn't comprehend what he represented. A lifetime of calculated precision, survival against impossible odds, instincts honed to perfection. And now, all of that converged in one quiet, unassuming man who had, until now, appeared to be just a passenger. Outside, the F-16s faltered, caught between fear and protocol. Elias' eyes shifted to the horizon, calculating the next phase, the move that would tip the scales entirely. The confrontation had begun, not with bullets, not with fire, but with recognition, fear, and the silent assertion of dominance. And in the sky above, the world waited for the next move, unaware that a single man could rewrite the rules of engagement entirely. The sun had climbed higher, a harsh glare cutting across the C-130's aluminum skin, bouncing off instruments and reflecting in the F-16 cockpits above. Elias Brandt moved with a fluid precision honed over years of combat, every small gesture calculated to influence what he could not yet touch directly. He didn't need weapons. The pilot's panic, their overcorrections, their fear of the unknown, were enough to give him control. Each subtle shift of his body, each calm breath, was a signal they couldn't interpret but that dictated their next moves. Callan Royce's knuckles ached from gripping the controls, sweat stinging his eyes. It's impossible. He shouted, voice breaking. Jenna Kessler's teeth were clenched, eyes wide, scanning instruments like a frantic searchlight. They tried to execute standard maneuvers, but every attempt faltered under Elias' silent orchestration. In military terms, he was unseen, unengaged, yet dominating. He was a ghost, and ghosts, as the pilots now painfully realized, could dictate the living. Elias rose from his corner and began walking toward the rear ramp. Each step was deliberate, subtle, like a predator stalking without detection. Soldiers glanced at him, noting his calm, but they had no idea that every micro-movement was a message. Stay alert, anticipate, act with caution. Outside, the F-16s flanked the C-130, engines roaring. They thought they were asserting dominance, but Elias had already anticipated their path. Every curve, every angle of approach had been logged in his mind before they even thought to execute it. The turbulence picked up, a gust slamming against the fuselage, shaking equipment, rattling crates. Callan and Jenna flinched in tandem, coordination faltering. Elias watched them through the small porthole, noting panic flicker in their eyes, tiny shifts in posture, hesitation that revealed their over-reliance on training over instinct. He allowed a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in stance, a tiny movement that triggered a cascade of miscalculations outside. The F-16s banked too sharply, then overcorrected, engines screaming in protest. Inside the cabin, one soldier whispered, "Sir, he's just walking." Another echoed, incredulous. Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence alone, the quiet command in his posture, was enough. He approached a control panel near the rear ramp, inspecting switches without touching anything critical. Every action, deliberate or not, communicated confidence to his comrades and chaos to the pilots above. The C-130 felt suddenly heavier, more anchored, as if Elias' calm had tethered the entire aircraft to certainty while the sky above teetered. Callan Royce attempted a coordinated maneuver, banking the F-16s in a tighter formation, trying to intimidate. But Elias had anticipated it. He shifted slightly, hands brushing against the fuselage, and the pilots misread it entirely. Engines screamed, and for a moment, formation broke. Panic intensified. They were no longer the hunters. They were reacting to an invisible threat, a single father whose face now haunted them with decades of skill, courage, and history. Elias' mind flicked to Amira, her small hand gripping his fingers in memory, the reminder of why he had to survive. Protecting her had been his mission long before this flight. Now, in the sky, the instinct to survive and protect merged seamlessly with the tactical genius he had honed over years. The F-16s, skilled, trained, and fast, had become pawns in a game they could not even see. That he paused near the rear ramp, turning slightly, letting the sun catch the edge of his face, his expression calm, unreadable. Outside, the F-16 pilots faltered again, unsure of what to do next. Elias Brandt had not fired a single shot, yet the scales had tipped. The table had turned. And the storm, silent but lethal, was now fully in motion. The roar of jet engines echoed across the sky like thunder, but Elias Brandt's focus remained unshakable. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, silver waves catching the harsh sunlight, indifferent to the chaos above. The F-16s flanked the C-130, their pilots frantic, voices breaking over the radios, but Elias had already calculated every angle, every potential reaction. The storm was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and he was at its center. Callan Royce's knuckles were white from gripping the throttle, his jaw tight. "We can't. I don't understand." Jenna Kessler's eyes darted between instruments, the C-130, and the horizon. Their formation wobbled, overcorrected, and faltered under pressure. Recognition had shifted to fear, fear to desperation. Elias remained calm, letting the tension in the air thicken, each second a tool in his silent arsenal. He knew the pilots' training, their habits, even their tendencies under duress. It was as if he had rehearsed this exact moment in his mind 1,000 times over, decades of combat distilled into instinct. Inside the cargo hold, soldiers braced themselves as the C-130 pitched with turbulence. Elias moved deliberately to the center of the cabin, each step measured, eyes sweeping across the interior. He wasn't there to fight, not yet, but his presence alone had changed everything. One glance from him, a subtle tilt of the head, a slight shift in posture, sent ripples of tension through the cockpit above. The pilots' reactions were raw, instinctive, and entirely predictable. They were already reacting to a threat that had not yet acted. Callan attempted to stabilize his F-16s, shouting over the radio, "Command! He's impossible. What do we do?" Jenna's voice trembled, frustration and disbelief mingling. Outside, the planes faltered, jerking slightly, engines straining. Elias allowed a faint smile, knowing that psychological dominance had already achieved more than any missile or gunfire could. The pilots were trapped in a mental chokehold, unsure of how to proceed, reacting to him rather than their mission. Then Elias made his move. Not a strike with weapons but a strategic demonstration of control. He shifted toward the rear ramp, then paused, standing tall in the rising sunlight, his silhouette clear against the open sky visible through the cargo door. The F-16s twisted and banked, misreading his posture as intent. Callan swore under his breath. Jenna gasped. Fear became tangible, a living thing, wrapping around both pilots as they tried to anticipate a move that didn't exist. Elias had turned presence into power. The C-130 shuddered as turbulence intensified, crates rattling, soldiers gripping harnesses, yet Elias remained steady. His mind flicked back to Amira's face, her small hands in his memory, reminding him why he fought, why survival wasn't optional. Every heartbeat, every careful breath, was dedicated to her. Outside, the F-16s attempted another maneuver, more coordinated this time, but Elias anticipated even that. Subtle shifts, invisible to anyone not trained in survival at the edge, allowed him to manipulate the aerial chessboard entirely. Then came the moment of absolute clarity. Callan froze mid-maneuver, eyes wide. Jenna's hands shook on the controls. They both realized the truth. Elias Brandt was not just a passenger. He was a master strategist, a living weapon, and every panic-driven adjustment they made played directly into his control. Recognition had shifted into acceptance. He was untouchable, untamable, and now entirely dominant in the unfolding scenario. Elias allowed himself a slow breath. The pilots above, trapped in their fear, had no idea how to respond. They were following his lead without knowing it, responding to instinct rather than reason. And in that instant, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The reckoning had arrived, not in fire or destruction, but in mastery, precision, and the unassailable authority of a man who had survived everything life had thrown at him. The storm in the sky had a name, Elias Brandt. And the pilots would never forget it. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, sunlight fracturing on the waves, oblivious to the war unfolding above. The C-130 pitched sharply as turbulence slammed against the fuselage, crates rattling violently, soldiers' harnesses creaking under stress. Elias Brandt stood near the rear ramp, calm as ever, his eyes sweeping the cabin and then the sky beyond. But inside, he felt the tension building, the moment approaching where patience alone would not suffice. The pilots above were fractured, every instinct screaming in fear, yet Elias knew he couldn't rely solely on their panic. He had to act. Callan Royce's voice shattered the radio again, almost a whimper. We can't. He's not supposed to be here. Jenna Kessler's hands were white on the throttle, her knuckles trembling as she fought to maintain control. Their attempts at coordinated maneuvers had become sloppy, predictable, and Elias read every micromotion. Every twitch of the controls, every subtle glance, revealed more than words ever could. Recognition had escalated into fear, and fear was now spiraling into desperation. Elias took a deliberate step toward the center of the cabin. Soldiers glanced at him, confused and wary, sensing the charge in the air but unable to interpret it. A bead of sweat slid down Callan's temple in the cockpit above. Jenna's jaw tightened. They tried to maintain formation, to execute protocol, but every action they took only fed the rhythm Elias had orchestrated. He didn't need weapons. He didn't need fire. Every reaction they had was part of his strategy. Suddenly, an alarm blared in the cockpit, an alert triggered by their own misjudgment. Callan cursed, jerking the controls violently. Jenna's eyes widened, the F-16s nearly colliding midair. Elias allowed a subtle movement, a slight tilt of his torso toward the open cargo door, and the pilots misread it as aggression. Panic fully consumed them. The breaking point had arrived, not for Elias but for those who underestimated him. Inside the cabin, a soldier whispered, "Sir, what is he doing?" Elias smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't answer. No words were needed. Every instinct, every movement, every calm breath communicated control, dominance, mastery. The pilots above were reacting not to a man but to a legend they couldn't comprehend. A man who had survived every impossible scenario thrown at him, who had returned from battles thought unwinnable, who now existed above them as an unassailable force. Callan attempted one final maneuver, banking sharply to intimidate. Jenna followed instinctively. Engine screamed. But Elias had predicted it, anticipated the subtle overcorrection that would come from fear. The planes wobbled violently, almost colliding, and the realization struck both pilots simultaneously. They were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and had been manipulated entirely without Elias touching a single control outside the C-130. Elias' mind flicked to Amira, her small hand in memory gripping his fingers, reminding him of why he had to survive. Protection had always been his mission, but now it extended beyond his daughter. It encompassed every life depending on the flight's success. With a subtle adjustment, he shifted his stance, eyes calm, presence commanding. The storm he had carried silently through the years had now fully manifested. The F-16s faltered again, their formation splintering under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Callan's radio sputtered incoherently. Jenna's voice was a low, shaking demand for clarity. But Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The breaking point had been reached. The pilots were defeated by perception, by instinct, by the sheer force of a man who refused to be underestimated. The sky, turbulent and unforgiving, seemed to acknowledge the shift. Control had passed. For the first time in hours, Elias exhaled fully. His hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes flicked to the horizon, and the tension in the cabin eased. Outside, the F-16s regrouped hesitantly, wary, fearful, but still alive. Inside, soldiers began to realize the quiet man they had assumed was just a passenger had carried them through chaos, through the brink, with nothing but skill, patience, and presence. The breaking point had been reached. And from it only one truth remained. Elias Brandt was no ordinary man. The Pacific sun hung low on the horizon, casting golden streaks across the rippling water. The C-130 cut through the sky steadily now, no longer jolted by panic or miscalculations. Elias Brandt sat near the rear ramp, finally allowing himself a quiet breath, muscles unclenching, heartbeat slowing. The storm had passed, but the memory of it lingered, a vivid reminder of the fine line between chaos and control. Soldiers around him began to relax, their glances filled with awe and cautious relief. They had survived the impossible, carried through it by a man who had appeared ordinary only moments before. In the F-16s above, Callan Royce and Jenna Kessler finally stabilized their aircraft. Their hands shook as they gripped the controls, their eyes locked on the C-130 below. They were exhausted, humiliated, and deeply shaken, not by the physical threat, but by the presence of a single man whose reputation had proven true. He's incredible, Callan whispered, voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. Jenna nodded silently, swallowing hard, still processing the fact that the passenger they had dismissed had completely dominated the skies without firing a single shot. Inside the cabin, Elias reached into his backpack, carefully retrieving the photo of his daughter, Amira. He held it in his hand, letting the sunlight catch the corners of her smiling face. She was the reason he had endured every battlefield, every ambush, every sleepless night filled with uncertainty and fear. Protecting her had always been his mission, and now, after this impossible flight, he could be certain that he had survived once again to keep that promise. The soldiers around him began murmuring, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "Sir, how did you?" one of them asked, voice breaking. Elias offered a faint smile, calm and unassuming. "Sometimes being a passenger is just the first step," he replied softly. No one pressed further. They didn't need explanations. They had witnessed skill, patience, and mastery beyond comprehension. They had seen the quiet force of a man whose life had been defined by impossible odds and unwavering resolve. As the C-130 descended toward its landing zone, the pilots above adjusted their course, finally in sync with reality. Callan radioed, voice steady but respectful, "Command, mission status stable." "The passenger, he's handled it." Jenna followed with a nod, acknowledging Elias' unspoken command of the skies. Recognition and respect replaced panic, and for the first time in hours the air was calm. The impossible had been survived, and the world had shifted subtly under Elias Brandt's silent mastery. Touchdown was smooth, the wheels of the C-130 rolling steadily on the runway. Soldiers began disembarking, some exchanging wide-eyed glances. Elias stayed near the ramp, watching as everyone moved past him, still in awe of what had just unfolded. He adjusted his backpack, shoulders squared, and allowed himself a small, private smile. The mission had been accomplished without a shot fired, without chaos spreading beyond controlled bounds. He had maintained every life under his care, preserved the trust of those who relied on him, and upheld the promise to protect his daughter. Later, in the quiet of his home that evening, Elias sat beside Amira, brushing hair from her forehead as she recounted her day. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "Dad, did you have a good flight?" she asked innocently. Elias chuckled softly, hiding the weight of the day's events behind a smile. "The best flight ever, baby," he said. And in that moment, the legend faded into the father, the hero into the man, and all that remained was love, protection, and the quiet knowledge that he had survived the storm, both in the sky and in life. Elias Brandt, the man the pilots feared, the soldier the world whispered about, was finally home. And for him that was the only victory that truly mattered.